Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. And I'm happy to welcome you to our last podcast of 2019, which is also the second episode of In Their Own Words, our new oral history series. This episode is with Dr. Kent Holsinger, Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Biology in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Connecticut. And he's also a past president of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. If you're interested, you can read along with the text version in the pages of BioScience. But for now, let's go to the interview. So Dr. Holsinger, thank you very much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so the first question is, when did you first know that you wanted to work in the life sciences?
So it's hard for me to remember when I first knew I wanted to work. I've been interested in life sciences since at least grade school. And if I had to identify when I knew I wanted to work in life sciences in some sense, it was probably my sophomore or junior year in high school.
And was there anything particularly that appealed at that time?
Well, it's just I grew up in a small town in rural southern Idaho, so I spent a lot of time outdoors, fishing, hiking, and so on. And so I just always been interested in being outdoors, and I was interested in some kind of work that would allow me to continue that interest.
What would you say is the biggest surprise of your career?
So I think it depends on where you start thinking about a career starting, or when you were thinking about a career. And so if you start from when I was in college and pretty clearly focused on some kind of a career in life sciences, the biggest surprise is that I ended up at a big university on the East Coast, because I'd always imagined myself going back to a small liberal arts college similar to the one I went as an undergraduate. If you think a little later than that, after I sort of was in graduate school and then maybe, even as a starting assistant professor here at the University of Connecticut, the biggest surprise is that I'm now a dean.
How has that been a surprise?
Well, because it's not something I ever envisioned that wanting to do or being asked to do it, because I think like many people who start out on a research track, especially in life sciences, you see the people on the who are in administration as deans and provosts and presidents as being on the dark side, and you never want to become one of those people.
It sounds like it's potentially far cry from, outdoors in the wilderness of Idaho.
It definitely is. I've managed to keep, since becoming the dean a little over 7 years ago, I've managed to keep some research going, and I've managed to get away 3 or 4 times for a few weeks of field work in South Africa. But most of my time is sitting behind a desk, answering emails, or in meetings dealing with administrative issues at the university.
But is that fulfilling in its own way?
Oh yeah, it's definitely. If it weren't, I wouldn't continue doing it. It's a contribution of a different sort, because instead of as an individual faculty member, I'm able to have a large impact on the small group of graduate students who I have had the privilege of working with directly, or larger groups that I teach. But as dean of the graduate school, the things I'm working on have an impact on 7,000 enrolled graduate students at the University of Connecticut, and so that's very satisfying.
What would you say is the biggest difference between the way science is conducted now versus the way it was when you first entered the field?
Well, so I think the one difference that's enormous that affects all science is the internet, because I got my PhD in 1982. ARPANET existed, but at least in life sciences that I knew, nobody even knew it existed. When I got to UConn, we were on BitNet. The internet was in its infancy. Almost no one ever used email, much less anything having to do with the World Wide Web or anything like that. And so now, with the internet, email, Skype, Zoom, whatever, it's just the ability to communicate with colleagues all around the world virtually instantaneously is just a game changer. Because, like for collaborations with people in South Africa, we can just set up a conference call on Skype and talk about issues we're interested in real time, as opposed to sending a letter, waiting for a week for it to come back, and so on, or trying to do it over the phone. So that's one. And then a little bit more focused on biology, the genomics revolution, especially in the last 10 years with the high throughput sequencing, it's a game changer in terms of what it's possible to look at with respect to genetic variation in non-model organisms in particular.
And I'll ask a very unfair question, but which do you think of those two is the bigger deal? And I ask that largely because, communications is something that is an incredible revolution, but it's not something that's frequently cited when scientists talk about technological advances.
That's tough. I guess I would say overall, I guess it depends. Here's how I'm going to say it. It's hard. I can't really say one is more important than the other. They're important in different ways. The internet is important for the process of how we actually get science done. It's just made facilitated collaborations and communications, and facilitated communication on a scale that just wasn't imaginable when I was in graduate school. And so that's changed sort of the way in which we do science. The genomics revolution has changed the content of what we do, so that it allows us now to ask and to answer a whole host of questions that we could barely imagine even asking when I was in graduate school.
That's a very good answer to a very unfair question. Thank you. So how have professional societies played a role in your career? And what's kind of the biggest single event, if you had to name one?
So I can't really think of a single event per se, but professional societies have been an important part of my professional careers since the beginning. I mean, for one thing, one big way in which the world has changed is when I was in graduate school. Although I was at Stanford, and so we had a very good library. Nonetheless, if you wanted to read what was going on in your field, the sort of typical way you would do that, you would get access to the literature, is you became a member of, in my case, the Society for the Study of Evolution, or the Botanical Society of America, or the Genetic Society of America, and you'd get their journals monthly or quarterly or bi-monthly, and you'd sort of know what was going on, and so you'd read those journals. That's where, if you look at my CV, I don't know what percentage, but a very large fraction of the papers I've published over my career have been in society-sponsored journals like Evolution, AJB, Ecology, BioScience, and that sort of mix of things. And then also the annual meetings that most professional societies sponsor are an incredibly important place to sort of share work before it's quite ready for publication, to find out what other people are up to, and to have some face-to-face connections with people who are working in your discipline, often doing things that are much more closely related to what you're up to than other colleagues in your home departments, and so to share expertise.
What would you say is the most challenging day that you've had on the job?
Probably it's sort of challenging and disappointing as well. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember the feeling pretty well. I had been here at the University of Connecticut maybe 2 or 3 years, so I was still a pretty new assistant professor, and I had just put in a proposal to NIH for the second time. So it had been declined the first time, but it had gotten sort of okay reviews, and I spent a lot of time working on the revisions, really felt good about it, turned it in, and in those days you got the results on a pink sheet in the mail, and the pink sheet came back, and not only was it declined, but it got a much lower priority score than the first time around. And I just remember driving home that night, and it's just this, like somebody punched me in the gut, because you just put so much of it into yourself, and then into it, and then to have the reaction be that this isn't even as good as what they had seen before was really tough to take.
That sounds difficult. Did you then abandon that project, or did it kind of come back in a different form?
No, actually, that one I did end up abandoning, because it was not it wasn't really. It was something I was interested in, but it wasn't really central to what I was interested in, and it was on the edge of my expertise and interest, and so I just decided, forget it. I'm going to just drop that and not do it anymore.
It sounds like sometimes that's a good way to bounce back.
Yeah. Well, and and it's not like I say that's probably the worst day, but it's not like the same thing hasn't happened again. It's just that I'm used to it now.
Right. What would you say is your best day on the job?
It's really hard to pick a best day because frankly, I feel like I've been very fortunate in my career, and I've had a lot of good days. But one that I remember, and this is actually one that happened after I became dean, and it involves research, was in the first year of a big collaborative project that we had through the Dimensions of Biodiversity program at NSF. There was a group of about a dozen or 15 of us from Yukon who spent 5 weeks in the Cape region of South Africa collecting samples and data for later analysis. And one day in particular, I remember with my postdoc and one undergraduate and a graduate student hiking about 1,000 meters up a jeep trail to collect samples in Babianskloof, which is a really isolated but beautiful part of the Eastern Cape province. And it's standing at the top of this ridge, looking over the Karoo on a beautiful, clear, sunny day. It was just like, wow, this is why I became a biologist.
And sticking with the positives, what's a favorite memory from your time working with the IBS?
Yeah, so I don't have a story per se, but I remember one. I think my favorite time in AIBS was there was a president's conference in, I think it was 1999 at Airlie in just outside of the D.C. in Northern Virginia in the horse country there, and it was something where virtually all of the presidents of AIBS member societies came to that workshop for, I forget, it was 2 or maybe 3 days to sort of think about what's the future of AIBS, what should AIBS be doing, what should its future be, and because at that point in AIBS's history, up until 1995 or 96. One of the main things AIBS had been identified with was organizing big meetings in the summer, and these meetings involved the Ecological Society of America, the Botanical Society of America, and a number of smaller societies. And I forget whether it was 95 or 96 was the last of those big meetings, and AIBS was drifting a little bit, and it wasn't clear where it was going to go. And a number of the things that came out of that meeting in 1999 sort of set the stage for what it did in the next 4 or 5 years in the early 2000s. And that's also the place where Bio1, of which AIBS was a founding member, was really getting off the ground, and people were beginning to think about whether that was something that their society would participate in.
What would you say is the single funniest thing that's happened in your career?
Oh, yeah. So probably the funniest thing, this was actually on a job interview. When I was interviewed for a position at the University of Toronto, the University of Toronto, at least, and I don't know whether this is true of all Canadian universities, had an interview system that's sort of like the system they have in Great Britain. In the it's the sort of system we think of in the United States, where you go, you visit, you talk to faculty individually, you give a departmental seminar, and so on. But they threw in something that's a little British, which is, in addition to that, then at some point I had an actual interview in a room with the department chair and the search committee, sitting around a table in a more classic, commercial type job interview, where people go around the table and ask me questions, and I'd respond to those questions. And one of the questions had to do with whether I really thought there was a future in understanding the evolution of plant mating systems, and is that an area of research that's really important? And so, in an attempt to demonstrate how important it was, I was mentioning several very prominent people who were doing this important work and describing what they were, and I was mentioning the institutions where they were. One of the people I mentioned was Spencer Barrett, who I said was at the University of British Columbia, and he was sitting in the room, of course, because he's at the university, which I knew, and I had somebody else in mind, but I said his name. So that's probably it was sort of embarrassing, and I didn't get the job. I don't think that's the reason I didn't get the job, because Spencer and I are good friends, but that was sort of a funny incident.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That must have been a terrifying moment.
Yeah, it was. Well, as a matter of fact, Spencer was just here for a seminar visit last spring, and he had got great pleasure out of telling our graduate students about that incident.
Okay, that's good. Didn't take it badly.
No.
What event from your career do you think will be the best remembered into the future?
You know, I really can't think. I really can't think of any event that I think will be that, or anything I did like that will be long remembered. I think it's possible that sort of some of the scientific contributions I made on evolution of plant mating systems and the role of what's called pollen discounting, some of the work that I've done more recently on statistical methods for describing the distribution of genetic variation among populations, and then some of the stuff I've been doing on empirical work on proteas in the last 10 years. That may have some people may remember that for a while, but other than that, I can't think of anything, any particular thing I've done that people would remember per se. Okay,
fair enough. What are you working on right now?
So I'm working on a couple of things, and when I say I'm working, what I really mean is I have students who are working on these things, and I get together with them and talk with them about how their work is going. And so the one set of things I'm working on has to do with the relationship between the physical or structural traits that plants have, like how thick and heavy their leaves are, and the physiological functions like photosynthetic rates or rates of water flow through stems, and then ultimately their performance in terms of how many seeds they set, their fecundity, and so on. So there's that, and then also how those traits influence or don't competitive effects among species, and that's work that one student has been doing in Protea for several years. And then another student who's just, in fact, handing in her dissertation next Thursday and going on to a postdoc has been working in Pelargonium, looking at the relationship between climate change over the last century in southwestern South Africa and the timing of peak flowering in Pelargonium, across the genus Pelargonium, and also looking at how projected climate change over the next 50 to 100 years in South Africa is likely to affect the geographical distributions of species in the genus.
Any early spoilers? Are they going to make it?
So I don't remember the exact number, but the student who I just was talking about in Pelargonium just presented a poster at the Botanical Society meetings, and if I recall correctly, it's something like 70 or 80% of the species of Pelargonium are going to see moderate to substantial range reductions over the next 50 years if the projections hold.
And if you were entering grad school today, what would you do differently, if anything?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, the world is very different now from when I entered graduate school, and I have a better sense of this since I've been dean of the graduate school now for 7 years. So I really understand sort of where things are going in a way I might not if I were a faculty member. But I think the big difference, and I'm not in a way it's not a difference, but it's a difference we're aware of now that we weren't when I was in graduate school, is that I think anybody who's entering a PhD program in particular needs to be aware that there's a very good chance that although they will be employed, because the unemployment rate for PhDs is really small, but B, that there's a very good chance they will not be employed as a tenure-track faculty member at a college or university. They might be employed in some other capacity at college or university, but more than half of PhDs are employed outside of colleges and universities. And so I think one of the things I advise all incoming doctoral students especially, is to make sure they're aware of the range of careers that the skills you acquire in a PhD program actually prepare you for, because they're not just preparing you to be, or maybe not even primarily preparing you to be a faculty member. You might work in a government agency or a nonprofit as an editor, as a consultant, or any of a variety of things. And so to really be aware of what of what your skills are, how those map into a variety of different careers, and what the career options are, so that you actually are well prepared for anything life has to throw at you in the future.
Okay, and that answer may feed into this one, but if you were entering grad school today, would you study anything different, and if so, why?
So I don't think I would. I've been, in part because I think one of the challenges I had, it took me a while to actually land a faculty position. I think one of the reasons is because I had a very wide range of interests. I'd done theoretical population genetics. I'd done systematics and nomenclature, and I've done ecology. And so I sort of am, I guess I'm sort of a dilettante. I sort of dabble in a whole bunch of things, and I probably would continue to do that because it's worked out reasonably well. But I think the big thing is that anybody who's entering graduate school, especially if they're entering a PhD program, where they're going to be there for 4, 5, maybe 6 years, you really have to pick something that you personally love. And what you love is likely to be different from what I love. And so because I've never met anybody who's completed a PhD who didn't hit at least one major obstacle along the way. And if you don't really love what you're doing, you're not going to finish.
Well, that's both a great note to leave it on and the end of my questions. Dr. Holsinger, thank you very much for joining me today.
Sure thing. Happy to do it.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.